My son showed up and said, "My wife, kids, and mother-in-law are moving in. They're tight on space in the apartment. Everything's already arranged." And he left full of confidence to pick them up. But when they came back, what they saw left everyone speechless. The late afternoon sun dipped gently behind the smoky mountains, casting golden streaks across the wooden porch where Susan sat, cradling a warm mug of chamomile tea. The rocking chair beneath her creaked with each slow motion, a familiar rhythm that echoed the quiet of her days. At 65, Susan had grown used to calm, the soft chirping of cicadas, the rustle of oak leaves and wind, and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. Her world was quiet, measured, and hers. She lived alone now, in the house her husband had built board by board 4 decades earlier, a charming wooden home in Asheville, North Carolina, with blue shutters, a wraparound porch, and flower boxes Susan tended with care. After his death 5 years ago, she had retired from the town library and filled her days with books, gardening, and occasional chats with Carol, her nosy but kind-hearted neighbor. Nothing ever truly changed in Susan's life until that Thursday. She had just finished refolding the linen napkins when the crunch of tires on gravel drew her attention. A dark gray SUV pulled into the driveway, too new to belong to anyone she knew. As she stood up, shielding her eyes from the sun, her heart skipped. David, her son, stepped out of the car with the same hurried energy he had always carried, even as a boy. His smile was tight, his eyes darting past her. She hadn't seen him in nearly 8 months, not since Christmas, and his visit, though welcome, felt oddly abrupt. "David?" she called out, stepping down the porch steps, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is everything all right?" "Mama," he said with a rushed hug. "Glad you're home. Listen, I can't stay long. I'm just here to pick up Amanda, the kids, and her mom." She blinked. "Pick them up from where?" "From here," he said quickly, moving toward the back of the SUV. "They're going to stay with you for a while. We've already packed most of their stuff. They'll be moving in tonight." Susan froze, her hands still slightly damp from drying dishes. "Wait, what do you mean stay here?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he popped open the trunk and began pulling out bags. "It's temporary," he added. "Amanda's job situation changed, and the apartment isn't working out. We talked about it, and this is the best option right now." "But no one asked me," Susan said, her voice quiet, yet shaking at the edges. David stopped for a second, then exhaled. "I know. I should have called. It's just been crazy. Look, it's only for a few months." And with that, he was back in the car, reversing down the drive before she could get another word in. Susan stood on the gravel, hands limp at her sides, watching the taillights disappear beyond the bend. A breeze lifted the hem of her skirt, but she didn't move. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Her son had come and gone in less than 10 minutes, and had left a message that would alter everything. 4 people. Amanda, 2 children. Beverly, Amanda's mother. She had known Amanda to be reserved, polite in a distant way, always glued to her phone. Beverly barely spoke a word to her at the wedding. The children? She barely remembered their names. Susan slowly walked back toward the porch, heart thudding in a disoriented rhythm. Her home had always been a place of reflection, filled with the hum of old radios and the smell of lavender oil. Every object had a story. The Afghan on the couch that her husband once used to nap under, the ceramic turtle on the windowsill that David made in the 3rd grade, the piano she hadn't touched in years. And now, for new lives were coming to occupy the sacred space, and she hadn't even been asked if it was all right. She sat back down, the rocking chair creaking beneath her again. The tea had gone cold, but she didn't notice. She stared out across the lawn, the magnolia tree swaying gently in the evening light. Her thoughts felt tangled, hurt, confused. There was no anger. Not yet. Only the dawning sense that something deeply personal had been violated, like a diary read aloud without consent or a locked drawer forced open. Her solitude wasn't just being interrupted, it was being replaced. As the sun finally slipped behind the hills, darkness crept across the porch, and Susan remained seated, unmoving, watching shadows stretch across the yard. This house had held decades of love, laughter, mourning, healing. It had held her. and now it would have to hold much more. She didn't know where they would sleep. She didn't know what would change. But what hurt most was knowing that her son, the one she had raised, protected, and trusted, had already made all the decisions. Without her, Susan woke the next morning to a hollow stillness that echoed her unease. The air felt different, not yet filled with the sounds of other people, but heavy with the knowledge that soon it would be. She lingered in bed longer than usual, eyes fixed on the water stain in the ceiling she had always meant to paint over. But the list of things she had meant to do suddenly felt irrelevant now, replaced by an invisible checklist of what would have to change. She moved through the house slowly, as if walking through someone else's memory. In the small second bedroom, the one she hadn't opened in months, she ran her fingers along the dusty dresser that had once belonged to her husband. His scent, faint but stubborn, still lived in the air, tucked into folds of the old flannel shirts hanging in the closet. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the walls, lined with books and faded photographs, reminders of a quieter life. There was no room here for bunk beds or toy boxes, no space for chaos. After breakfast, she began moving things, not out of enthusiasm, but necessity. She folded her husband's clothes, placing each item with painful care into cardboard boxes she found in the garage. She hesitated at his leather boots. One still held the shape of his foot, the memory of his stride. She placed them gently at the bottom of a box and sealed it, her hand trembling as the tape cut across the top. The room began to feel less like his, and not yet anyone else's, just hollow in between. She stripped the bed, dragging the old quilt to the laundry room, her heart clenching at the thought of children smearing juice on it. In the living room, she stared at the arrangement of furniture, the deep burgundy armchair where she used to read, the glass cabinet filled with porcelain birds collected over a lifetime. Where would they put a playpen? Would they move the cabinet? Would Amanda care that one of those birds belonged to her grandmother? That afternoon, Susan drove to the store for extra bedding. She felt oddly like an intruder in her own routine, pushing a cart filled with items she didn't choose, plastic cups with cartoon characters, a child's laundry hamper, a toothbrush holder shaped like a frog. At the checkout, the young cashier smiled and said, "Grandkids visiting?" Susan managed a tight smile, something like that. When she returned, the house looked exactly the same, but felt entirely different. The silence no longer soothed her. It felt like the last deep breath before something irreversible. She placed the new items in a pile by the front door and walked through rooms once more, measuring spaces, counting beds, calculating how to stretch a house built for 2 into a shelter for 6. Her mind spun with practical questions. Where would Beverly sleep? Would the kids share the second bedroom, or would Amanda take it? Should she move her sewing machine out of the hallway nook to make space for her desk? Every answer led to another compromise, another loss of something small but precious. Later that evening, Susan called Carol. Her voice cracked before she could say anything meaningful. "They're moving in tonight," she said softly. There was a pause on the other end. Then, "And how do you feel about that?" Susan stared out the window at the driveway. "Like my home isn't mine anymore." Carol exhaled, the kind of sigh that held understanding. "Do you want to come over?" Susan shook her head. "No. I just needed to hear someone who remembers this house before." That night, she didn't sleep much. She lay in bed listening to the creaks of the old wood, memorizing the stillness. At some point, she got up and opened the attic door, pulling down the ladder slowly, carefully, as if she were unearthing a secret. The attic was dusty and cramped, filled with old suitcases, Christmas decorations, and forgotten boxes. She began moving things around, clearing a space large enough to fit a cot or maybe a twin mattress, just in case. When the sun rose again, she stood barefoot in the middle of her living room, now more aware than ever of how little space it truly offered. The walls had always embraced her, made her feel safe, but now they seemed to lean inward, as if already bracing for the impact of the lives about to collide within them. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast, but the comfort had drained from it. Susan stood at the counter, stirring a pot of oatmeal, imagining voices echoing in the hallway, toys strewn across the floor, someone else reaching for her teacups. The quiet would soon be replaced with footsteps, arguments, televisions too loud, doors that no longer closed gently. She looked down at her hands, strong, weathered, capable. She had built a life here. She had buried a husband, raised a son, and stitched together years of routine and healing in these rooms. Now, with no warning, she was expected to erase parts of that past to make space for a new future she had not chosen. She turned off the stove and sat down at the table, her appetite gone. Outside, the magnolia trees swayed again in the morning breeze. And somewhere deep in her chest, something she had never needed to name before, some combination of sorrow and steel, began to stir. The hum of the moving truck could be heard before it appeared. Susan stood at the kitchen sink, wiping down the already spotless countertop, when the low mechanical growl made her spine stiffen. She moved to the window, her heart thudding without permission, and watched as the large white vehicle rumbled its way up her gravel driveway. It was larger than she had expected, much larger. This was not a van of suitcases and weekend bags. This was a statement, a declaration. The life arriving was not temporary. It had volume, weight, permanence. She reached for the plate of freshly baked cookies on the kitchen table. She had baked them out of instinct, a reflex she could not entirely explain. Perhaps some part of her believed that the scent of vanilla and butter might ease the tension, as if sugar could soften what was being torn apart inside her. But when the truck doors flung open and Amanda stepped out in yoga pants and a colorful hoodie, holding throw pillows as if they were treasures, Susan realized no amount of sweetness would suffice. Behind Amanda, the children tumbled out, Elijah and Maddie, if she recalled their names correctly, already squabbling over a tablet. They didn't notice the carefully trimmed hedges, the flower beds, or the house itself. They ran past Susan without a greeting, dragging bags behind them as if the place was a motel and not the home of a woman they barely knew. Beverly, Amanda's mother, stepped out last, adjusting her oversized sunglasses and immediately surveying the property with a look that resembled disapproval more than curiosity. "Hi, Susan," Amanda said, placing the pillows on the porch swing as if claiming it. "This place is cozy." Susan forced a smile, lifting the plate. "I made cookies." Amanda took one with a distracted thank you, already looking around. "So, we were thinking the living room needs to be opened up. That big chair near the fireplace. It's got to go. It blocks the whole flow." Susan blinked. "That chair was my husband's." "Oh," Amanda said, biting into the cookie. "Well, maybe we can just move it to the garage for now. The kids need a space to play, and the couch is a little stiff. Might be time for a change." Before Susan could respond, Beverly chimed in from the porch steps. "Susan, do you have storage space for seasonal decorations? Because we brought some of our own. The autumn stuff you have out is very traditional." Traditional. The word hung in the air like an insult disguised in lace. Susan kept her voice calm. "I have an attic." Beverly nodded, not looking at her. "Perfect. I'll have David move our bins up there. We brought some new curtains, too. These dark colors probably aren't great for the kids' mood." Susan's hands clenched around the plate. She set it down on the side table and stepped back, trying not to let her face betray the burn rising in her chest. In the driveway, David had begun unloading boxes, stacked high and taped with labels. Kitchen, Amanda's room, toys, storage. He avoided her gaze, keeping his focus on the boxes as if the physical labor could shield him from accountability. In the hours that followed, the house was pulled apart with shocking efficiency. The living room rug was rolled up, toys spilled across the floor. A television she didn't recognize was carried in and placed in front of her fireplace, replacing the quiet space where she used to drink tea and read. Her dining table was shortened to make room for a plastic playmat. Beverly reorganized the pantry without asking, pushing aside Susan's spices and teas to make room for juice boxes and instant noodles. No one asked permission. They simply moved, assumed, replaced. By late afternoon, Susan found herself retreating to the porch, the only place that had not yet been touched. She sat with a cup of cold tea and listened to the muffled chaos inside, Amanda's voice issuing commands, the children arguing, Beverly complaining about the softness of the guest bed mattress. A box labeled books had been left outside, and Susan glanced at it, curious. When she opened it, she found it filled not with novels, but with self-help manuals, therapy workbooks, and educational DVDs for toddlers. The insult was subtle, but it landed. Carol called around 6 o'clock, asking if she needed anything. Susan's voice was hollow when she replied, "No, I'm fine. They're settling in." That night, dinner was a blur. Amanda reheated frozen meals in the microwave without asking if Susan had planned anything. The children refused to sit still. Beverly sat at the table correcting Maddie's posture and commenting on the saltiness of the food. No one thanked Susan for setting the table. No one noticed she had used her best china. When the dishes were cleared and the kitchen filled with the clatter of unfamiliar routines, Susan retreated to her bedroom. Locking the door behind her, she leaned against it, heart heavy, eyes burning. It was no longer her home, not in the way it had been, not in the way that mattered. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and inside, someone turned on a cartoon too loud. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the faint buzz of her thoughts louder than anything on television. The lines of her life were being rewritten with someone else's ink. But as she closed her eyes, one truth began to sharpen beneath the chaos. A thought not yet fully formed, but quietly growing stronger. She would not allow herself to disappear. Susan had always prided herself on her quiet resilience, on her ability to absorb discomfort without letting it spill into the world around her. But by the end of the first week, that inner reservoir had begun to run dry. The routine she had spent years building, the careful rhythms of her days, had been dismantled piece by piece. Every corner of her home now echoed with the presence of others, voices she hadn't invited, needs she hadn't anticipated, objects that didn't belong. It wasn't just noise. It was erasure. The transformation was almost surgical in its precision. Beverly, who had taken full control of the kitchen, now dictated what meals were prepared and how. The labels Susan had lovingly placed on her spice jars were removed, replaced with laminated charts from a nutrition guide Beverly swore by. Amanda worked remotely from the dining room table, now surrounded by extension cords and chargers, while the children created endless messes that no one seemed interested in cleaning. Susan picked up crayons on the floor like someone collecting evidence from a crime scene, silent, meticulous, invisible. The final fracture came on a Tuesday afternoon. Susan had returned from the grocery store with a few small bags, fresh herbs, a head of cabbage, a loaf of the rustic rye bread she liked. She walked into the house and stopped short, her chest constricted. The door to the second bedroom, the one that had held her husband's belongings, his scent, his absence, was wide open. Inside, the room had been cleared entirely. The walls were now painted a pale blue. A flat-screen television had been mounted above a white storage unit stuffed with video games and cartoon DVDs. The old dresser was gone. The bookshelves had been dismantled. The few boxes she had packed so carefully were stacked carelessly in the garage, their labels peeling under the weight of dust and disregard. Susan stood in the doorway, the bag of groceries sliding from her hand, apples rolling across the floor. No one heard them. No one noticed. For several long minutes, she did not move. Her heart beat hard in her chest. Not from anger, but from the sudden absence of something sacred. That room had been a tether, a quiet altar to memory. And now it was gone, rewritten, repurposed, like she didn't matter. When she finally turned away, the edges of her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. She moved through the house like a ghost, bypassing Amanda's conversation on speakerphone, ignoring Beverly's complaint about the washer settings, stepping around Maddie, who was spilling cereal on the couch. She didn't say a word. She simply went to her bedroom, closed the door, and sat in the silence until nightfall. At some point, David knocked. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked through the door. She didn't answer. He waited a few seconds, then walked away. The house resumed its routine without pause, without curiosity. By morning, Susan was gone. The discovery was made by Beverly, who was the first up. She knocked on Susan's door expecting to ask about laundry detergent, but found the room empty. The bed was made. The closet was closed. The window was slightly ajar. The keys to the car were gone. Panic didn't strike immediately. just confusion. Amanda assumed she had gone for a walk, maybe driven to town. But when noon arrived and the car hadn't returned, her phone calls went unanswered, and none of the neighbors had seen her, a tension began to rise. David left work early. His face was pale when he pulled into the driveway. Amanda met him at the door, holding her phone. "Still nothing," she said, clearly annoyed but trying to mask it with concern. "She's not picking up." "She's never done this," David muttered. He checked the garage. The car wasn't there. He checked the attic, the basement. Nothing. They called Carol around 4 o'clock. The neighbor's voice cracked slightly over the phone. "She told me she needed to clear her head," Carol said. "But she didn't say she was leaving town." "Did she say where she was going?" "No." David hung up without another word. By evening, the tension had turned into fear. Beverly made a comment about Susan being too sensitive and dramatic, which Amanda did not challenge. The children sensed something was wrong, but weren't told anything. David sat on the front porch for over an hour, phone in hand, refreshing messages that never came. When the sun set and the headlights still hadn't returned, his shoulders slumped in a way Susan would have recognized, like a boy who had broken something he didn't know how to fix. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the headlights finally appeared. The sound of tires on gravel stirred everyone. Amanda moved to the window. David opened the front door before the car had stopped fully. Susan stepped out slowly, holding a manila folder and a worn handbag. Her expression was unreadable. She looked rested, but different. Not angry, not even sad. Just settled. David rushed forward. "Mama, where have you been? We were worried." Susan looked at him for a long time. "I needed to think. We should have known. I should have asked you what." She cut him off gently. "Not now. Call everyone to the living room." Inside, the house had gone quiet. Amanda stood behind the couch, Beverly by the hallway, arms crossed. The children were already asleep. David sat down slowly. Susan remained standing, the manila folder held firmly in her hand. Without raising her voice, she spoke clearly. "I've made some decisions." Then she opened the folder and laid its contents on the coffee table. No one said a word. The folder sat on the coffee table like a quiet storm. Susan didn't sit. She remained standing, poised in a stillness that radiated resolve. The air around her charged with a calm intensity that made it impossible to look away. Amanda glanced at the papers without reaching for them, her face flickering between suspicion and irritation. Beverly scoffed audibly, arms still crossed, her presence rigid and dismissive. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees, confusion clouding his features as he tried to understand what his mother had just walked back into their lives with. "These," Susan said, her voice steady, "are documents that outline the conditions for continuing to live in this house." Amanda's brow furrowed, and she exchanged a glance with her mother. "What are you talking about?" Susan didn't blink. "I spoke with an attorney this morning. These are rental agreements. If you want to stay here, you will, but there will be rules, responsibilities, contributions, everyone." Beverly snorted, almost amused. "Excuse me? You want to charge rent for your own family?" Susan turned her gaze on her, and for the first time since their arrival, Beverly looked genuinely taken aback. "This is not a dormitory. This is not a shelter. This is my home. If you're going to live here, you will treat it and me with respect." Amanda's face tightened. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like we're intruders." Susan's voice didn't rise, but it gained a sharper edge. "You are. You moved in without asking. You made decisions without my consent. You changed everything. And you expected me to shrink to make room for you." David shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. "There's a cost to taking over someone's life," Susan continued. "And you're about to learn that it's not always measured in money." She walked around the room slowly, addressing each of them without flinching. "You will pay rent. You will clean up after yourselves. You will not paint, rearrange, or throw away anything that doesn't belong to you. The pantry is not yours to reorganize. The kitchen is shared. If you want to cook, you ask. If you want to change something, you ask." Amanda opened her mouth, But Susan raised a hand. No more decisions behind closed doors. No more late-night noise. No more children drawing on the walls. And no more complaints about what's wrong with this house. If you don't like how I live, you are free to leave. David finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Nam, I didn't mean for it to go this way. Susan's expression softened just enough to acknowledge his regret. But it did, and now we deal with it like adults. There was a long silence. Beverly stood rooted in place, as if too stunned to object again. Amanda looked at David, then back at Susan, and finally walked over to the table, flipping through the documents. Her jaw clenched, but she said nothing. Susan knew this wasn't compliance. It was calculation, but it was enough. For now, over the next week, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It was not a sudden transformation, but the beginning of a long, necessary recalibration. The children still bickered, but they began to pick up after themselves when reminded. Amanda, begrudgingly at first, took turns with the cooking and stopped replacing the grocery list without asking. Beverly no longer monopolized the kitchen and retreated more often to the guest room, her interventions growing less frequent with each passing day. Susan, for her part, reclaimed her home in quiet, deliberate ways. She brought the burgundy chair back into the living room. She returned her spice rack to its rightful place. She unboxed her husband's boots, placing them back in the bedroom closet where they belonged. She didn't speak of the past. She didn't explain herself. She simply occupied her space again, fully, unapologetically. David visited her in the garden one evening, just as the sun began to drop behind the hills. She was kneeling near the rosemary bush, trimming it carefully, her fingers steady and sure. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, standing behind her. Susan didn't look up. "I know." He hesitated. "I should have talked to you. I was just trying to keep everything together." She nodded slowly, still focused on the plant. "You thought I would bend." David sat on the edge of the porch step, watching her. "You didn't." "I shouldn't have to," she said, finally turning to face him. "Not in my own home." He nodded, the weight of his choices finally settling into something resembling understanding. In the months that followed, the house became something new. Not a battleground, but a space of boundaries. Amanda learned to knock before entering Susan's room. The children learned to lower their voices. Beverly, though still opinionated, stopped treating Susan as a relic to be managed. The rhythm wasn't perfect, but it was balanced. And Susan, having walked to a quiet annihilation of her comfort and emerged with her dignity intact, felt something return to her, something she hadn't realized had gone missing. Her voice, long buried beneath the polite restraint of motherhood, widowhood, and womanhood, now rang clear when she spoke. She was no longer background noise in her own story. She had been heard.